We are already pioneers. We are already destined to go to places where it's difficult and hard to survive, but where we actually have the means and the technology to do so.
The moon is the proving ground. Mars is the horizon goal. This budget fully funds Mars 2020.
We imagine a future where humans could go to Mars.
We are working on the human lived experience of space.
But will we repeat the mistakes of our past?
The frontier is an incredibly powerful idea in the American imagination.
The new frontier of science and space.
When we talk about space exploration, we should not bring these harmful narratives from Earth's past.
Mars has a very particular planetary imagination. It's our closest planet, we've taken the most images, we've sent the most probes, and we have very rich imaginations, both science fiction as well as scientific, about Mars's past, present, and future. So Mars has become imagined as a destination.
Space colonization. Beneficial occupancy of possibly the last and highest frontier, the space beyond Earth.
This is Lisa Masseri, a space anthropologist at Yale.
So there's all these different analog sites that offer a chance to imagine what existence on another planet might be like. So with this group of NASA scientists, we lived in the Mars Desert Research Station. My main takeaway was it was deeply uncomfortable. Pretending to live on Mars, even for only 2 weeks, is like the worst of camping.
What we would like people to realize is that living on Mars could be like living in an extraterrestrial Arctic oasis.
Architect Bjarke Ingels has been hired by the Dubai Future Foundation to create the Mars Science City, a prototype for a permanent human habitat on Mars in 2117.
Things that would be unnecessarily expensive or complicated or irrational on Earth would actually make perfect sense on Mars. So if you're building on Mars, you have a very, very thin atmosphere. So you have to create a pressurized environment. The buildings are going to be 3D printed with the local sand. The normal buildings tend to be square because straight lines are cheaper to work with than curves. But when you're 3D printing, it's all about the time and the amount of material. So rounded corners are actually cheaper because they're slightly more materially efficient. So suddenly, instead of having this kind of ultra-rational, machinistic architecture, you could actually end up having this like really organic architecture on Mars. But then you also have too much radiation, so we'll also have large spaces underground. Water is actually the best shield against radiation. We will have to create a self-sustained small city. Inside, people live and work and grow their food. So it's not really this sort of arid tin can. It actually becomes like a lush oasis, having to contain breathable air and to create buildings using local materials. And finally, the protection against the radiation. Those three elements combined is really what becomes the starting point for a new sort of entirely Martian form of architecture. We're building a prototype in Dubai. We're actually trying to recreate the conditions as much as possible so that you will actually have the feeling of what it's going to be like living on Mars.
We are working on the foundation of interplanetary civilization, so the technologies that you would want in your Martian settlement. I'm Ariel Ekbla. I am the founder and lead of the MIT Media Lab Space Exploration Initiative.
And we have 28 different research groups all across science, engineering, art, and design.
You don't necessarily want to live in a space habitat that was designed just by an engineer or just by an artist. You need the meeting of the minds.
Ariel's project, the Tesserae, is a self-assembling architecture.
Can we make this something that is on-demand, modular, and reconfigurable? You can take these tiles, pack them flat in a rocket.
So somewhat Indiana Jones style.
Then, once they're in orbit, they're released in this microgravity environment and allowed to float freely, and as the tiles are swirling around, they're drawn together through the force of magnets.
And they'll be able to snap together and self-assemble, slowly growing into a much larger structure.
One of the reasons that you see spheres so often in science fiction is that they are the most optimized volume for a given surface area. So what's expensive in space? It's the thing that you have to ship up from Earth and pay payload fuel for. So you want to maximize how much interior space you can use.
You've got to create that whole base of civilization, but without a lot of the handy things we have on Earth.
Build up the base, starting with one ship, then multiple ships, then start building out the city.
then making the city bigger, even bigger. So you'd also have to have mining, refining, hydrocarbon production, which you can then turn into plastics.
I guess, how do you mine a planet without destroying it?
You don't. I'm Lucianne Walkowicz, and I'm an astronomer at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. There's no way to do some of the operations that companies would like to do that don't violate our policies about planetary protection as they stand now. The governing document that has really set the tone for really all of human spaceflight has been the Outer Space Treaty. It really contains a lot of very aspirational things. We won't have weapons of mass destruction, military installations on other planets. We should not do things to other worlds that might contaminate them and make them unusable. You know, most signatories were probably like, nah, maybe, until we have the ability to actually go after resources. Now, because of the Space Act, there is this permission to be able to extract resources. It could also mean something like water. You know, if you want to own the water on Mars and there is biology in it, then what? Is a planet's worth only determined by the presence of life?
The space colony is where human beings can conduct fruitful industry.
It's very common when talking about Mars, and especially human futures on Mars, to talk about it as the next frontier.
Space, the final frontier.
As a site of colonizing.
The long-term goal of SpaceX is to develop the technologies necessary to colonize Mars.
These words and ways of describing potential futures are steeped in language of settler colonialism that connects back to the United States' own founding.
For anyone who was living here, folks who were indigenous, those narratives are not neutral. They're not neutral for a vast majority of Black Americans who descend from people who were brought against their will.
Breaking the land with freedom's plow.
When we talk about space exploration, it's worth thinking about not only the language we use, that we not bring these harmful narratives from Earth's past, and that we rethink the motivations that we bring to it as well. A lot of the narratives that I've heard put forward are based in the lure of wanting a second chance, really a do-over to escape some of our responsibilities. But, you know, just as in space as on Earth, wherever we go, there we are.
Going to Mars is not an escape from our problems, it's actually the solution. When you look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, the technology that we need in order to fulfill those goals are the same technologies we will need to sustain human life on Mars.
Where else on Earth do we need rapidly scalable, modular, easy to assemble architecture? Maybe in areas torn by natural disasters, maybe in refugee camps. And so we're now working to build models of this, not just at space scale, but at Earth scale.
I just had my firstborn son in his lifetime. I think he will have to make a choice, like should I maybe like move to Mars or not?
That new space home